Say you'll remember me flowing down the slipway, going into high gear. Say you'll remember me. Well. Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 1 of 4 of the long patrols from the Patron 44, which was on the 27th of January, 2022. Now, I'm going to start off by saying, if you want more information about these things, the stuff, there is, of course, some books. Now, these are the two I have myself. There are others, but these are the two I have myself. This is the more of the storybook, I would argue. It's a lovely narrative story. It goes through it all. It gives you a wonderful history. And it's a nice, if you want something which is an easy read history of shipbuilding in the UK, the rise and fall of British shipbuilding is very good. Honestly, if I was going to describe it in simple words, it would be a love letter to shipbuilding. However, if you want all the really good, technical details, if you want the stuff which is going to make you vibe, and really, if your passion is having the knowledge and having the information, if your passion is doing all that and knowing all that, then this is the book for you. British Shipbuilding 1500 to 2010 by Anthony Slavin. Now, I do not know why it is that the histories of engineering shipbuilding are both written by Anthonys. In my experience, Anthonys are usually quite nice people, but I have no idea why the two, and these are definitely on Amazon the two most popular books, but these are, with my students, the two most popular books, why they're both written by Anthony. But there again, this shipbuilding book of wooden shipbuilding is but written by two guys called James. So I don't know. Perhaps there is something going on in this world. Perhaps things get paired with names. This is the sort of book which has tables, it has all the detail you can possibly want about shipbuilding and ship construction, and it has some gorgeous photos in it. It really is. But this is the far more intense read. This is the book which you get if you really want to know shipbuilding, and it has some really gorgeous things in it. It's not just warships, it's merchant ships and the full cornucopia of the marine world and maritime world. It's worthwhile getting if you are interested in it and if you want it. Now, some people are probably going to come back to me and go, oh, what about books on British shipbuilding and German shipbuilding? Well, American shipbuilding, and German shipbuilding and other shipbuilding. I do have some books on those, and I'll be talking about them at the time. I might actually turn shipbuilding into something I occasionally go into in quite long detail, especially if patrons continue to suggest those topics. Because there isn't really a quick way of doing shipbuilding and discussing shipbuilding when you're doing it all in the round. It's a wonderful area, but it's also part of the key infrastructure. Someone has already commented that Tirpitz, when having a chat with Admiral, said he found it strange that when the British, they build their ships limited by the dockyards, and the Germans, they build the dockyards to fit their ships. Well, that sort of works out if you're working just on dockyards from your own base. But the British, A, had quite large dockyards already all around the world, and B, they needed the fleet to go all around the world. So you need to think about those things, and that becomes a limiting factor. And it's also a big limiting factor when we start to talk about post-World War I construction. Because if the Royal Navy had been wanting to build their dream ships, they would have had to build bigger slipways. They were already talking to Camellards about increasing the size of their largest slipway and their largest dry dock, or graving dock, as we've talked about. And they were looking at that around the world. I have no doubt that if the G3s and N3s had come into service and there had still been as said, a sort of race with it would have been a very different dreadnought race between America and the UK. It would have been a tech race, not about numbers of ships, but it would have been who had the biggest and the best. So expect runs of 2 or 3 ships, maybe 4. If they're trying to make a solid a solid division of ships, of battleships, in that sort of time, because the traditional battle squadron was 8 ships, divided into 2 divisions of 4. They might decide they might reduce down squadrons to 4 ships. They were looking into that, and they were sort of heading that way, and did get there because of the treaty system. So they might have been. It would probably been batches of 4. So there'd probably been 4 G3s, if all 4 had been built, and 4 N3s, and 4. It would have gone on like that. I think definitely if they'd had to do that, then you would have probably seen a lot of infrastructure work in the UK to accommodate the ships which would have come after the G3s and the N3s, because they would have been bigger, and they would have done the infrastructure around the world. Because again, it always sounds strange when you're talking about it. Deterrence is cheaper than war. Peace is always better economically than war. So deterrence preserving peace is always the cheaper route to go, if you have to go it. If the treaty system hadn't worked, if the treaty system hadn't been implemented, especially if Britain and America felt they couldn't implement the treaty system. So if Japan hadn't signed up, or if Britain had felt that the treaty was too onerous on it, so it couldn't sign up, or America, for some reason, had a Congress which actually was prepared to fund the Navy and wanted to build up the Navy, then the money would have been found. The UK has a lot of shipbuilding. The quote, of course, there is, at the start of the 20th century, half of the world's ships were being made in the northeast of England. That is a level of industry and dominance which you rarely get. Even America, at certain points prior to, it builds up and it drops down, builds up and drops down, builds up and drops down. Britain keeps it fairly consistent. You would have to argue that the biggest problem for Britain in maintaining that and keeping that consistency is because one of the foundations which had underpinned and provided a continuity of work, especially for the industries behind ship production, and a continuity of investment, had been the Navy, had been the priority role of the Royal Navy in Britain and its maritime security and global security and its empire. So when you have a treaty system and you have limited construction, you don't have the same throughput of construction going through as traditionally there is, even though after wars there was often a dial down in production, but usually dialed up quicker. Let's be honest. If it hadn't been for the treaty system, there is no doubt in my mind that not a single C-class cruiser would have still been around come World War II. Let alone a Hawkins class. They would have been gone. Whatever the county class equivalents produced in a non-treaty system would have been, they would have probably been around. But they would have been the older cruisers, and there would have been far newer ones. This is the point. There would be a far more throughput of construction going on. And again, that's part of the British way because it's seen as economically important and sensible. It's a legacy which is left to the UK today. If you're building ships abroad, you are on a very big problem. There's no debate about, there's no demurring about the concept of the Joint Strike Fighter of the F-35 being built and procured from abroad, or parts of the Eurofighter, or any of that. That, in the British mindset, thanks again to a legacy of World War II, importing aircraft, yeah, that's fine. If you announced you were building the Type 83 abroad, or any of our warships, you would deal with a national uproar. Not because people are passionate about Navy, but because there's something deeply rooted in the British psyche that our ships have to be built here. They might not care about it day to day. They don't think about it day to day. No one does. But it's there. And it's a political third rail that it's not so much touched, but the politicians of all sides understand it. It's there. You can sell the ships, you can cut the Navy down, but if you tried to build the ships elsewhere, then you would be in a lot of trouble. And honestly, I sometimes think that's one of the problems with the Horizon frigate program, was because there were lots of discussions about where the ships should be built. And Britain was always going to build its own. But there was a suggestion that maybe sections of those ships would be built abroad, would be built in France and Italy, to share out the construction, make it more fair and appropriate to considering for each other's investment. That was always a non-starter. It's always a non-starter. Before you ask, that's not there because of me advertising to you my book. That's there because I was winding up some colleagues earlier by just having it prominently displayed. So, these are good books. And they will give you a good overview, far better than I can give you in what will be for roughly probably 45-minute, maybe an hour video, long patrol videos and the live. But I will try and give you as much of an introduction overview as you can get. So let's start off with my favourite yard. This is, of course, the yard where my dad did his apprenticeship, where he became a shipwright and learnt to be a naval architect. So it's very attached. This generations of my family were involved in camel lads and were involved in shipping and the industry around the Mersey and Liverpool. And there were also generations of family on the other side of the country, and generations of the family down in Devon. So we served in the navies, well, mostly in the Royal Navy, a couple in the Russian Navy, I think. And we built the navies, served in Merchant Marine. That's what my family seemed to be doing. They seem to have had a passion of going off to sea and either coming home and building more ships, building houses, or going into banking, and then having a third career of farming at some point in their lives. They're a fun group. Privateering a lot as well. We'll leave that to one side. What can I say? So, camel lads are still, of course, going to this day, and they are still important to this day. If you want a really fun thing to do, look at their facilities, look at their current website. It's very cool, and you will notice immediately that, well, hang on, these two are still there, and the big basin is still there, but some of these have gone. Basically, some of those down there more. This one is still roughly there. But this one has gone and has been replaced by a far larger one at an angle. And that is a beautifully sized one, and is one of the few dry docks, graving docks, of course, which can actually accommodate the Queen Elizabeth class. However, as my good friend Pete Sandyman, who's the Navy Lookout, the guy who writes Navy Lookout, has written in his article about it, there is a small issue in that whilst it's theoretically big enough, it's right next to the road, and so security would be a nightmare. But that's if it stays that way as it is. There are discussions about building a larger one in Portsmouth for the Queen Elizabeth class carriers. There are also discussions to build perhaps a larger one in Birkenhead for the Camel Lairds. Because ships are growing bigger, and having a larger graving dock is useful. And camel lairds are one of the best shipbuilders in the world, and they won't want to be limited by the size of their graving dock. But it's getting funding, planning permission, and making the business case for it. As long as we have access to a safe, that's probably okay. Now, camel lairds themselves, they started off as, well, they started off by a merger of two companies, Laird Brothers of Birkenhead and Johnson, Camel and Co. of Sheffield. They built railway stock as well until 1929, and then that side was put into the Metropolitan Camel Carriage and Wagon Company. They were founded in 1828. 1828. And whilst this is the map of them in 1909, they are, as I said, still going to this day. They managed to carry on working, but they were actually didn't close down until 1993, and then they were re-established as a ship repair yard and have since been reborn and have won a lot of contracts as repair and maintenance yards and are growing in capacities. They, of course, have built the RFA Sir David Attenborough, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to get more contracts in future. I would honestly say if the Type 83 is going to be a big vessel, they have to be one of the yards in contention to build them. And they really are a very, very useful space. Then we have the River Tyne, which is the most important river. If the northeast of England built half the world's shipping in the beginning of the 20th century, then a good 2/3 of that was probably built along the River Tyne. Either built entirely from hull up, or hull built elsewhere and fitted out here. This is the space you have to think about when you're talking about British shipbuilding. Now, there are some people who would point out, oh, but they can't fit the battleships in those dry docks, and they can't. Do they have the slipways? And of course, they have far more space as it goes down the river. And shipbuilding slowly moves down the river as the ships need more space, bigger space. But also, we get better at engineering. We get better at taking areas which are less than suitable building areas and turning them into something helpful. You know, some of the yards built further down the river are built on pretty much areas which were marsh or other spaces, which you can, with a lot of work and a lot of engineering itself to build the yard on and turn it into something useful. According to the wonderful Tyne shipbuilding history site, which you can find on the link down below will be, iron shipbuilding starts in the Tyne in 1839 when Thomas Marshall launches the Star, which was thought to be the first iron-hulled steamer on the river. And in 1842, his yard at South Shields built the Bedlington, the world's first steam collier. Colliers, of course, are ships that transport coal, and this one would carry coal from River Blythe down to the mouth of Tyne, where they were loaded onto sailing ships which would do the oceanic voyages. And this is another thing you start to realise. The British shipbuilding starts early. And it gets there. It really does. There are some really interesting ships built in this period, including this picture, which is of the Russian ice-breaking train ferry built at Armstrong Mitchell at that time's Low Walker Yard in 1895 to 96. It's assembled on a slipway, then dismantled, shipped to Russia, where it was reconstructed and launched in 1899. So, meet the IKEA ship. And it's not the only one that does that sort of things. But this is a really advanced project for its time. It's an ice-breaking train ferry. It's cool. It's mind-boggling that this sort of thing is being built in 1895 when you think of the level of technology. Everything is worked out by and paper and pen. There is none of the computing, none of the CAD, none of the stuff we rely on today for making designs, and that's what they're building. And that's got to be precision engineering, because it's got to line up with railways. Armstrong Whitworth. I love this company. As you know, I've talked about them a few times. And Armstrong Whitworth are very cool when it comes to shipbuilding. This is their major division of their company. So from 1879 to 1880, the shipbuilding company was Charles Mitchell, and they laid down a cruiser for the Chilean Navy at Low Walker Yard. That vessel was then supplied to Japan as Disiki in 1883. The ship, when it was finally launched, though, was launched as an Armstrong Mitchell build. Why? Because there'd been a little bit of a merging. And then in 1885 between 1885 and 1918, Armstrong built warships for the Royal Navy, the Chinese Navy, especially those vessels of the Beiyang Fleet, the Imperial Russian Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the USN, apparently. Admittedly, they also included HMS Glatton, which would suffer a magazine explosion in Dover Harbour due to water being not put in properly in the magazine, in that they used paper rather than cork, but we'll leave that. That seems to be one of the problems. When you have a ship which is the smaller ship and is technically being built for another navy, sometimes some of the supervision doesn't go well, which can suggest problems in the wider yard structure. I do know Armstrong Whitworth were very, how do I put this? It was very unusual in the quality of their builds for something like that to happen. And these shipbuilding companies, Armstrong Whitworth, of course, merges with Vickers and becomes one of the largest companies in the world. And it's based off shipbuilding. But you also have something like Palmer's. Now, Palmer's had built HMS Queen Mary, a battle cruiser. They built HMS Resolution, an R-class battleship. They would build HMS York in 1928. And yet, in 1933, they would go bankrupt. And this is a major loss. Yes, a lot of their infrastructure is taken over by other companies. But specifically Armstrong Whitworth. And Swan and Hunter. But yes, the Depression hits British shipbuilding. Yes, it does. But again, what was the thing that the British government had always applied to maintain shipyards and keep them going in times of recessions? They ordered warships. It was as tale as old as time. We're entering a recession. What are our good yards? Let's order some cruisers, probably possibly a class of battleships. It's one of those things when you start people talk about the traditional economic approach, and they go, "Oh, British governments were always laissez-faire," and they sort of go, "That means hands off." They didn't intervene in the economy; they let it go, but they didn't. They'd build infrastructure. They'd encourage councils to build infrastructure and other national work schemes. There was always house building, but you could do subtle things, and you could do things like building ships. Why are building ships useful? Because that's a lot of industries used. That's China for plates, that's glass, that's a lot of wood, even in a steel ship, an iron ship. All these things were options that the treaty system, to an extent, takes away, which is a problem. There's also another problem, because to an extent, not enough yards go. And I would argue the British have a huge, tremendous rump of yards. They're still going, still a large number of yards. And this means that they go into World War II with these yards. They're very good. They're there, and they keep them going. But post World War II, they've got a lot of old yards which they need to upgrade, and that requires money. It also requires keeping the workforce on site and the industry to invest, and managing all those two things, when it's actually going to be quite difficult, and people are going, well, I'd prefer a quiet life, and maybe if I bury my head in the sands, this won't cause a problem. And of course, that's what leads to a lot of the 1960s and 70s and the problems in the shipbuilding industry that happen, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, when things really collapsed in the UK. Because the shipyards had left it too late. Whereas if you're talking about the American yards, well, most of them were built really as World War II was coming. They were sort of building new yards because they had to. That was good. And then post World War II, when Japan, etc., and Korea are rebuilding, they take their time, but they build up their yards. And now those are the yards which, in many ways, dominate still to this day in terms of construction. Because they were built to deal with the newest, latest, and greatest stuff, and that's what they're going to do. That's what they're doing. So there is that problem that you didn't have the investment that normally led to competition, which had been why British yards had innovated and developed themselves prior to the treaty system and allowed the Royal Navy to be in a position it was in World War One. But and then you still had the Depression didn't really hit as hard in terms of shipbuilding as it might have done. So the yards that were there were still very good, capable of dealing with production, which meant they stagnate. You had a lot of factors built into stagnation. Now, Southampton is one of those interesting ports. There is an argument as to when the first port was set up there. We know there being a settlement as far back as the Stone Age. We know the Romans settled a site around 70 AD and operated a busy port which serviced the towns of Winchester and Salisbury, which were major Roman towns. The settlement is thought to have been abandoned in roughly 407 AD, and the Saxons would found a new town across the river from the Roman site around 700 AD. And this was a trading port. My view has always been slightly different, but I do realize the archaeology doesn't back this up. In my view, rarely do towns completely disappear, especially port towns. But they do sometimes swap sides depending on which they consider is the most defensible position. There is something which is defensible. There is a position which is defensible under the Roman conditions when you have Roman power. Romans have achieved quite a level of peace and prosperity, and there is setting up your space when you don't. And I would find it strange that the trade routes which have been going on and going through a very natural and very good port space for 300 odd years at this point would then disappear for 300 years only to suddenly crop up again because someone suddenly notices that that port space is still there and is an excellent place to bring in ships. Maybe I'm just being suspicious. I would have to have a longer chat with some of my archaeological friends on that one. But either way, since then, since around 700 AD, we have a consistent port. We have something being built there and something going on. And in 1016, Canute is crowned King of England in Southampton. In fact, that's why there's a 200-ton floating crane named after him in port. This is a major advantage for Britain, Southampton. It's never really a naval port, it's always a merchant port. And that's principally because Southampton has naval uses, but it's always such a busy merchant port that the Navy doesn't so much want to move in, especially once we have a professionalized Navy. A lot of ships were hired from there during the medieval period. Then we have Harland and Wolff. I do love Harland and Wolff. They are another shipyard which has absolutely amazing website and a gorgeous picture. You cannot go to their website and look at their cover picture because it is beautiful, and it shows off their graving docks, it shows off the space, it shows off how they are developed and how they've been lined out, and it's just gorgeous to look at. It really is. It's also another yard which theoretically has the space to take the Queen Elizabeth class. But as is pointed out in Pete's article, which he was a very well written article, site security would need to be upgraded, and there's no personnel accommodation there. But everything else is excellent, and it does, though, also depend on the existing work, what they might be doing there. And of course, the dock I'm talking about is not on this map. You can see two docks on this map, but the one I'm talking about is built later on at pretty much the end of the isthmus. It's sort of perched out right on the end. So it's quite easy to get into as well for ships. Harland and Wolff starts off in 1861. It was nationalized in 1977 and privatized again in 1989. And it has therefore been going for roughly 160 years. Its ships constructed include, of course, Titanic, Olympic, Britannic, HMS Belfast, Pendennis Castle, which was a lovely looking ship, and of course Canberra. They are currently focused on expanding offshore wind power, and 75% of the company's work is currently based, as of 2011, on supporting offshore renewable energy. They've certainly had the facilities for doing that. But they have the facilities for doing other stuff as well, if needed. And they do keep working at it. For example, the company which now owns them also owns Appledore, which are the Devon shipbuilders. And now we have Swansea. Swansea is one of those sites which has to be seen from the air really to be believed at how big it is. How much has stayed the same, but also how much it has grown. There are whole areas which are not on this map, which have been built to accommodate its growth and its design. And it really does have the capacity for a lot of ships to be looked at. And a lot of ships to be docked. Theoretically, there's been a coal port from around 1750 there. But in 1834, parliamentary powers were obtained to improve the facilities at the port, and Aberfan Harbour Company was set up to undertake this work. Further, in 1834, in 1836, the company was renamed the Port Talbot Dock Company and authorised the diversion of the River Afan into a new channel or cut, and so this is to start building a proper port. So the facilities we see today are mostly, we can trace back to that, to the early 19th century, 1834. Again, there is an advantage for Britain. It builds up a lot of this infrastructure and a lot of things which underlie its strength in the 1800s. In the 19th century, a lot of stuff is built up. And this is where the security for Britain in terms of infrastructure comes from. It's an unusual period in that you do get a lot more willingness by government, etc., to invest in long term. This might well be because they're coming out of the Second 100 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, that sort of period. And that has made them think in terms of longer term because they're fighting wars for so long. But I would also add it's an era of changing financial mindset, evolving from a mercantile to a capitalist approach in the world. And of course, mercantile view had been you had to control things in order to profit from them. Capitalist is you invest in things to profit from them. Combine those two together, those two views together, and you sort of get we have to invest in things in order to be able to control them approach. And that's sort of the transitioning period, is the early to mid 19th century, and to an extent it's still carrying on into the early 1900s, but it starts to sort of ebb away towards more of a capitalist approach of investment. This is the reality of what you're looking at. This is what the idea and the theories are behind a lot of the investments and developments which work in this period, and which is why Britain has these strong yards, which is why they have the shipbuilding they do, which is why they have the economic yards they do, the dry docks, and the other harbour facilities. It's not just about dry docks. It's about having basins, etc. You can bring ships in to shelter them while you're coaling them, because it's far easier to coal a ship alongside than it is sitting in the middle of a bay. It's far quicker to refit, to fix small things inside a basin than it is to try and do it at sea. And the more of these facilities you have, the better your fleet's going to be, because the more efficient you can make the maintenance and the quicker you can make the maintenance. And Glasgow. First time I went round a ship under construction, it was HMS Montrose. I was a wee lad, and I went up with my dad to go around this Type 23 frigate he was overseeing the construction of. It was amazing. And that started off a love affair with the city in many ways, as well as the history of that shipbuilding up there. Because again, they are very good yards. Now, the River Clyde has been a centre for shipbuilding for a very long time. We know ships were being built in that area as early as the 15th century. Some people think possibly earlier. But it was really the 1800s, the 19th century, when Bowling Harbour, Denny Shipyard in Dumbarton, John Brown's on the Clydebank, and Govan Graving Docks became a real source of commerce and economy for Glasgow. The steam engine was what brought it about. It allowed it to expand its heavy industry, and between 1844 and 1963, Denny's shipyard alone built over 1,500 ships. Let's go through that again. In 119 years, they built over 1,500 ships. That's a lot of ships. Especially when you consider the technology. There are going to be people going, well, you know, you can churn out a Liberty ship in this many days, etc. Yes, you can. But that's later on. That's welding and all sorts of technology. We're talking about starting off at the 1844, the very early period. We're talking wood construction. And then slowly getting into iron and later into steel. You've got riveting. You've got all sorts of... Construction is not as quick. Also, there's a slight difference when some of your components are being pulled to your site by horses. It's a wonderful, wonderful, productive area. But again, after World War II, the industry starts to decline. The reason the industry starts to decline is because it has been so productive. It was so productive that people didn't want to mess with a good thing. There's that old phrase, yes, so often in the UK and everywhere else in the world, variations of it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's true. If a table isn't broken, don't fix it. It's fine. If a shipyard is still producing high quality ships, why start changing the processes? Because it's working. That isn't really a phrase you'd have heard in successful shipyards pre-World War II. It's certainly not a phrase you would have heard them pre-World War One. If someone turned around pre-World War One in a British shipyard, a successful British shipyard, and said, why should we look into this new system? We're already working fine. There is, of course, a debate, and someone's going to probably bring this up, about the constructors and the fact that they don't want to put small tube boilers on the Queen Elizabeth class. That's not because they're not keen on developing and investing in small tube boilers. There are lots of investment going on in small tube boilers at this time in Britain, and at that time in Britain. But it's more a case of, this is going to be a battleship. It has to work. We're already introducing enough changes. Do you really want to introduce another one? We're raising the speed. We're doing all sorts of things. That's another change. That's another potential thing that can go wrong. It's part of the constructors and the Admiralty seeking to de-risk risk. Anyway, we're going to take a great leap in these areas, so we'll not take a leap in these. We'll save that for another generation of ships. Which is wrong. Yes, they should have gone for it. And that would have made the Queen Elizabeth class the first ever fast battleships, because they would have been 28 knots, if not faster, if we consider how well they did on the engines they had and the space they had for them, and the productivity the British have of underestimating the amount of power they're going to get from their engines. Glasgow is important to this. Glasgow is one of the centres of this construction. And it cannot be overstated how important, especially John Brown's, is to development of shipyards and the development of British technology. John Brown's shipyard was possibly one of the most important sites for technological development in the history of British shipping. Browns were just as important as Parsons to development of turbines, to development of high-speed and high-pressure machinery. And it was the competition between Parsons and Browns which really spurred on development and pushed British ships and British design development further. And again, that's something you get a lot of. There is competition in British shipyards. There is competition for Royal Navy orders. There is competition for merchant orders. Because there is enough of an order throughput to allow for competition. Which is sometimes a point which needs to be explained. This is a bottle of still water. By the way, I don't usually buy water in bottle form. I consider it a waste of money. But our tap water is currently tasting funny. Don't worry about it, it's being sorted. And so, frankly, as I want to drink water at the moment and trying to be a bit healthier, I bought some still water. There are dozens of brands I can pick from because there is a huge market for water in this country. So I could pick what I liked, and what I decided to pick was the cheapest which was on offer, which is fine. Because it's water. However, if I want to buy a new processor for my tower, for my computer, I have pretty much two options. I can go for AMD, or I can go for Pentium. There might be small rounds, but that's my options. AMD or Pentium. They're in constant competition with each other, but they are the turbines of a modern computer system, and that's what you have to pick between, AMD or Pentium. And again, there is a large enough market that both those can compete for it, and it makes sense. But if you really were in a world where there was only a need for 5 computers in the whole world, then the odds are there wouldn't be. If there's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things being ordered a year, that's not enough work to keep multiple companies going and competing. If you have an entire fleet of 19 surface ships, 19 escorts, that's not enough to keep multiple yards competing. British government is currently thinking it might be enough. They're hoping it might be enough. They're starting off a frigate factory, and they're going to have the Type 83 project and all these things. But honestly, that's not going to be enough. Not in the current orders. Not unless they keep ordering variations on the Type 31, 32, 33 to keep that yard going. And then they turn another yard into, I don't know, the high-end production facility for Type 83 and the eventual Type 26 successor. But still, you need to order more ships to do it. Because basically what you're saying is you're going to have 2 specialist yards going that are going to be churning out variations on the same thing. That doesn't give you innovation, that doesn't give you competition. At that point, and this is the other advantage the Royal Navy has at this time, you might as well have those yards owned by the Royal Navy. If they are entirely dependent upon government contracts for their income, on one government contracts, for their income, their entirety of their profit margin is dependent upon a government contract, you have a problem. Then it's the whole point about these things being run and owned by private industry, which is a good idea if there's competition, if there's enough demand for competition. If you're building enough that there's competition and there's a viable competitive market, then that's great. Private industry is the way to go because it will tend to be more efficient, and they will, in their competition, you will find some advantages. However, if there's not competition because there just isn't enough demand, then you might as well own them yourselves if you're a government. Because all you're doing is funding a monopoly. You're just spending taxpayers' money funding a monopoly. And I know Nationalisation is a dirty word in modern politics in many Western countries. But you look at some of the scenarios for the UK, maintenance yards, etc., in Devonport and all these things, and you wonder, they exist solely to support the Royal Navy. That's all they do. They can't make any money from supporting anyone else. The Royal Navy is going to need that support. What is there to be gained by having those be owned by private industry? It's nothing. This is no reflection on workers and the people who work for them. This isn't. In fact, the workers are very good and probably would be the same people that whatever happened. But the point is, what is the advantage of it being owned by a private company? You can say, well, that private company can operate many sites and therefore, it gets experience from all of them. But does it? How many other sites will it have maintaining the Royal Navy's Type 23 or Type 26 frigates? Will it have lots of them? Because there aren't that many frigates to be supported. It's going to be one site. It's going to be one frigate maintenance facility, which is the same frigate maintenance facility. Well, what it means is the government doesn't have to make the upfront investment. The private company will. That's wonderful. How do you think the private company is going to get that money back? Because they're going to have to get loans at a far higher cost than the government can get its loans for. And they're going to have to make that money back from somewhere. And seeing as the government's going to be the sole contractor, that means their money is going to come back from the British taxpayer. And with a profit margin, because they have to pay profit. Because that's their fiduciary responsibility to their investors, to their shareholders, to provide them. Profit's not a bad word here. Profit's a good thing for a private company. But in this sense, you're paying more money than you have to in terms of the cost of the debt for the investment, and then you're having to pay profit on that, and you're having to pay for all sorts of layers of management and other things in the company, which are extra costs. If they were able to have the facilities and capacity that without affecting the Royal Navy, they could take on outside work from other navies, from other allied navies, that's a great thing. That's fine. Spreads the cost. But they can't. Because they're not big enough. They're not big enough to deal with the demands of other navies, because the Royal Navy is just big enough to require all the limited facilities they now have available. So this was not a problem that the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s or in any of this period had to deal with, because they owned their own shipyards. And it was another advantage they had when competing with the civilian-owned shipyards, with the private industry shipyards, because they had constructors and Department of Naval Constructors who knew exactly how much things cost, because they had to build it themselves and acquire it themselves. And so if someone tried to tell them, oh, no, it's going to cost this much, and were lowballing it, and the idea of adding on cost later, they knew. They would go, stop trying to lie to me. And if they were trying to pad it out, they'd also know. Okay, so what have we coming out? Well, this week we have the London-class cruisers, which I hope you're going to enjoy. And later in the week, we have the Battle of Dieu. That's going to be fun. I hope you enjoyed all, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you're going to enjoy parts 2, 3, and 4 of this, and take care. Bye.